Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're starting a small series on Ray Comfort's The Atheist Delusion. He speaks to atheists on college campuses about their beliefs and why they don't believe in God, and he tries to convince them that there is a God through various arguments, all of which are weak. I'll be doing some pretty drastic cutting of his video, and the reason for that is because I'm treating this as if he's talking to me directly, and hearing the same question answered by half a dozen different people over and over, it gets kind of old. So that's the reason that I'm drastically cutting this. So let's get started.
Are you an atheist?
Yes, Ray, I am.
When did you become an atheist?
I've always been an atheist. I've never held a belief in a God of any kind.
Why?
Because there's no compelling evidence to convince me otherwise, Ray.
Are you open to evidence?
Yes, of course I am. For such an extraordinary claim, it will have to be quite compelling, though. I need to make a clarification here about what I consider evidence. Evidence is a collection of objectively verifiable facts that are indicative of or support one position over any other. There's also a distinction to be made between evidence and good evidence, but we'll get into that in a moment.
Flick through the pages of the book I just put on your lap.
Well, I don't have your book, but we'll work around that. I have my own as a stand-in. One of my favorite, actually, but continue.
Look at the color pictures.
Oh, well, mine doesn't have pictures in it, but I get the feeling that that's not going to matter.
And I'll ask you a question.
Sure. What's your question?
Do you believe that book could happen by accident, that nothing produced the color pictures in the book, that red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet ink fell from the sky and formed itself into those beautiful pictures, and then black ink fell from the sky, or from nowhere, and formed itself into coherent words and sentences, capitals and periods and commas, making sense, page numbers fell from the sky, all in order, and then it bound itself and formed itself into a cover with artwork, and there we have a book. Obviously, intelligent design designed the book. Wouldn't that be correct?
Ah, yes, the watchmaker argument. Yes, obviously a watch, or a book in this case, cannot design itself, Ray. It has to be made and cannot produce itself randomly.
Can you see where I'm going with this?
Yes, I do, Ray. And this is where we get into the difference between evidence and good evidence. While it could be argued, as you undoubtedly will, that the appearance of design is indicative of design, that simply isn't the case. You use it as evidence for God, but it isn't good evidence, because the appearance of design has another explanation, which has been tested and verified, and we'll get into that in a second.
What is DNA?
DNA is an incredibly complex macromolecule that one could say is the blueprint for whatever organism it happens to come from. This is an oversimplification, of course. The reality is a bit more complicated, so tell me what you think about it and we'll go from there.
Your genes instructed your cells how to make your eyes and what color your eyes should be, and your hair and your height and your personality. Scientists call it the instruction book for life.
A bit of an oversimplification, but accurate enough for now, yes. The chemical reactions caused by DNA could be construed to essentially command the cells what to do and how to interact with one another. Now, I get the feeling that you're holding out on me, Ray. Where's your reasoning going?
DNA is made up of genes, and genes give instructions to the cells as to how your body should grow. Did you know that those instructions, the instruction book of your DNA, just your DNA, was laid out end for end, would go to the sun and back a number of times? That book of instructions is so comprehensive. DNA is the genetic information encoded in the cell of every living thing that instructs our cells how to grow and how to function. It's our genes that determine whether our skin will be dark or light, have brown or blue eyes, or red or green or yellow, have red hair, be brunette or blonde, be tall or not so tall, or the color of our feathers if we're a bird. Whether we're humans, fish, animals, insects, or plant life, the way our bodies look and operate has all been pre-written in the amazing book of our DNA.
What you've said here is essentially correct. Well, aside from trying to separate humans from the rest of the animals. We are animals, Ray. We meet the minimum criteria to be animals. We are multicellular organisms that must ingest and digest other organisms to survive. This seems to be a sticking point for you.
What do you think of the mentality of someone who believes a book fell together without a bookmaker?
That would be an asinine position to take.
Do you think a book could make itself?
I've already answered this, but again, no, a book cannot make itself.
Utterly impossible.
Correct. It would be impossible.
Do you believe DNA happened by accident?
If by accident you mean essentially random natural processes, then yes.
DNA exists in every living thing. Its origins don't matter. The fact that there is intelligent information tells us there must be an intelligent designer. Is this making you think?
Yes, it's making me think about how you're confusing the appearance of design with being designed by an intelligent agency. You also say the origins of DNA don't matter, yet you insist that it was intelligently designed, and furthermore say that it is a fact. I would ask why you think it's a fact.
Well, DNA is complicated, but the point I'm trying to make is very simple. Book designer or bookmaker, DNA, intelligent designer. God. Does that make sense?
There's the line I was waiting for. No, it doesn't make sense. It seems intuitive, but before you can say that a God designed anything, let alone DNA, you must show that a God exists in the first place. Presupposing a God isn't evidence, it's blind speculation.
What would you think of the mentality of someone who believed the instruction book for life, DNA, made itself?
Given what we know now in biology and what we've pieced together from the study of abiogenesis, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that. Through a series of known natural processes, DNA effectively built itself up through a series of chemical reactions. Now, while the odds of that happening are admittedly astronomical, that doesn't negate the fact that it did happen and could have happened on a great many worlds all over the universe. It's entirely possible that an intelligent race of beings in the Andromeda galaxy are having a similar conversation that we are having right now.
That's atheism.
No, Ray, that's not atheism. Atheism is a position held by those who, for one reason or another, do not accept the claim that a God exists. This, more often than not, is a result of a lack of compelling evidence. You're conflating terms here, though I can't tell if it's deliberate. A majority of atheists do accept scientific explanations because they learned about the subjects you reject, like evolution. That being said, there is a minority of the community that reject evolution, like you do, but they generally replace God with some form of extraterrestrial in my experience. They aren't reflective of the whole, except when it comes to whether or not we believe in a God, which is generally the only thing all of us agree on.
DNA couldn't make itself. It's impossible. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense, Ray. This is a case of your incredulity speaking. You don't think it's possible for DNA to have developed naturally, so you won't believe it, and instead try to shove a God into the mix as an explanation. While there are admittedly gaps in the study of abiogenesis, until all natural explanations and hypotheses have been explored, there's no reason to posit a God to fill in the gaps of our knowledge.
Because we're not just talking about human beings, we're talking about every form of life. Fleas, cats, dogs, elephants, cows, horses, trees, plants, everything has DNA, the instruction book for life, which makes the book in your hand just seem feeble compared to the infinite intelligence that must have put the instruction book for life together. Can you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I see what you're saying, and you're presupposing again. DNA is truly impressive and is, I'll freely admit, complex. However, that complexity and appearance of design is not in any way indicative of design. You see this as being directed, when in all actuality it is incidental and emergent from the bottom up, not directed from the top down. You're also ignoring the fact that we can show genetic ancestry, which traces perfectly with what we find in morphology about 99% of the time. And where we were wrong on ancestry through morphology, which is rare, genetic results allowed us to correct the errors. I'm getting off subject a bit. The point is that until you show a God exists, we have no valid reason to consider it as an option, because a claim like that, thus far, is untestable and unfalsifiable, so it isn't even a valid hypothesis.
Explain it to me, how a program could make itself out of nothing on how to make a human eye, giraffe size, elephant size, cats, dogs, puppies, flowers, birds, trees. Every living thing has DNA that's so complex, it's mind-boggling. It must have been a genius beyond any human reasoning that put it together. And to say it happened by chance is infinitely sillier than saying a physical book happened by chance. All I'm doing is reasoning with you. I'm not arguing. I don't want to win an argument. I'm just saying I want you to concede something that's absolute common sense.
Sure, Ray, I'll explain it. First off, program is not an accurate way to describe DNA. It works as an oversimplification, but that's where it breaks down. Chemical reactions resulting in the differentiation of cells, structures, and functions were refined and perfected over the course of a couple billion years. And this wasn't an instantaneous process. No one is saying that. Everything you've mentioned, from the eye to the divergence of species, is explained by evolution. Now, I know you don't accept macroevolution because you think it calls for something that it doesn't, like a dog giving birth to a cat or a bird, neither of which is possible nor allowed by evolutionary laws. But to answer your question, we can use the other part of the same theory, microevolution, which you do accept as variation within kinds. The point is that beneficial adaptations, or variations, to use your terminology, are passed down genetically and are further improved on or lost as natural pressures change. Eyes give a specialized advantage in well-lit areas and even in low light, and will subsequently be selected for more strongly than less sight-oriented organisms, because it improves survivability. Conversely, fish, for example, that live in completely dark cave systems don't need eyes, and the caloric resources to maintain something that's not being used by the organism outweighs the benefit of having it in the first place. If it is not being in any way beneficial to the survival of the organism, the natural selective process is going to weed that out because it's not being used, it's taking up calories and resources to maintain, and those are calories and resources that could better be placed elsewhere in the organism. The difference between life and a book is that life can reproduce on its own. Books, watches, cars, and all cannot do that. As a result, there are no mutations, no selection pressures to act on those mutations, and no improvement of survival or passing down of that genetic improvement to subsequent descendants. There's no point for me to concede here. You do not, and from what I have seen in the past, do not want to understand the subject that destroys your entire argument.
You're an atheist, so you believe the scientific impossibility that nothing created everything.
I feel like we're jumping subjects here, Ray, and that you're misrepresenting again. If you're trying to lump Big Bang cosmology in with evolution, then you clearly have a vast misunderstanding of science. They are separate fields and are in no way related. They study completely different things, neither of which rely on the other for anything at all.
You like Richard Dawkins, don't you?
I think he is a knowledgeable individual in evolutionary biology, not to knock the guy's work, but I do prefer others in the field like Dr. Jerry Coyne.
Do you believe nothing created everything, a scientific impossibility, which is what he believes?
Oh, that's where you were going with that. As much as I respect his work in evolutionary biology, he's not a cosmologist. And though he is free to have his opinion on the origin of the universe, he isn't actually qualified to speak with any authority on cosmology. I think, though, that he, like myself, doesn't believe the universe came from the same kind of nothing that you seem to be referring to, an absolute philosophical nothing. See, when cosmologists talk about nothing, they aren't referring to that. They're talking about a vacuum state in a quantum field, generally, or a couple of other different hypotheses that they have running around, which is actually something. So I can see how you would be confused. I don't want to get much further than that because cosmology isn't something I have a whole lot of knowledge on.
You don't believe in a creator of all things?
As if it wasn't clear by now, no, I don't.
Nothing can't create anything because it's nothing. There has to be something in the beginning.
As it stands, I wouldn't disagree with you on this. However, saying I don't know how the universe started is far more intellectually honest than saying a god did it without any evidence to back up that particular claim.
Professor Richard Dawkins, arguably the world's most high-profile atheist, believes that in the beginning there was nothing and that nothing created everything. As he attempts to justify this belief, admitting that it defies common sense, the learned professor calls nothing something. Watch the reaction of his audience.
Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. Which exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
As I suspected, it appears the entire audience misunderstood what Richard meant by that. To clarify, he wasn't referring to the absolute philosophical nothing that most every theologian is referring to when they use that word, but instead to the nothing that I mentioned earlier, usually something along the lines of the vacuum state in a quantum field. Lawrence Krauss and other cosmologists use a distinctly different meaning for the word nothing than you do, and that is the disconnect here, like the word theory in a colloquial sense as opposed to the scientific use of the same word.
The audience reaction confused the normally eloquent professor because he's not used to being the object of laughter. What he didn't realize was he was talking to people who were endowed by their creator with the virtue of common sense. This was just another case where the emperor has no clothes. Someone should tell this man who has deceived millions, "You're talking foolishness."
No, Ray, I don't think he was confused because of people laughing at him. I remind you, he isn't a cosmologist. So he isn't really equipped to talk about it any more than I am. He was using, from what I can tell, the same definition Lawrence Krauss uses, but because cosmology isn't his wheelhouse, he had a hard time articulating what he meant. This ties into the point I made earlier about the difference between how an everyday person would use a word and how science uses that same term. Just because you don't understand the science doesn't mean that people you don't agree with are talking foolishness, Ray. It means you don't understand the subject.
But there has to be something that created everything. You just wasn't God.
As of now, a God has not been needed to explain anything in nature. Given the track record of absolute failure for a deity to be a legitimate cause for anything, it's safe to say that there is no reason to try to put one in what is simply a gap in our knowledge. Because the next thing Ray comments on isn't a question about cosmology, but evolution, I need to include the clip from one of the people he's interviewing for context.
It's just evolution, how things became from one organism into many.
But that doesn't solve your dilemma of the initial cause. There has to be an initial cause. If there was a big bang in space that from there issued cats and dogs and horses and cows, the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, and all this marvel of creation came from a big explosion, what caused the explosion and where do the materials come from the explosion, and why is there such incredible order from the explosion? Every explosion I've heard of creates chaos, not order.
Okay, Ray, we have a lot to unpack here. Let's rewind this a bit.
That doesn't solve your dilemma of the initial cause.
You're conflating evolution with cosmology again, two different scientific fields that have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
There has to be an initial cause. If there was a big bang in space that from there issued cats and dogs and horses and cows, the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, and all this marvel of creation came from a big explosion.
Now look, I know you're in your groove here, but I honestly can't tell if you think the Big Bang shot out fully formed planets with life already on them, and with those planets orbiting their stars, or if you're misrepresenting this to someone who isn't familiar with the arguments you use. Also, an explosion isn't the proper way to describe what happened. It was a rapid expansion according to the data that we have. I know the distinction is difficult to grasp. The best analogy I can come up with is to imagine the Big Bang itself as the pressure wave in the air that results from an explosion. Not the explosion itself. The explosion here is the cause of the pressure wave, the cause of which is still a mystery to us. But you were saying?
What caused the explosion and where do the materials come from the explosion, and why is there such incredible order from the explosion? Every explosion I've heard of creates chaos, not order.
Again, explosion isn't an accurate description of the event, As for where the materials or the order you refer to, which I can only assume are the strengths of gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, came from, the answer is, we don't know. No reason to shove a God in there yet, Ray.
This is what you're looking for if you were looking for truth. This is your information that you need to say, wow, that's logical. How could all this design from the atom to the universe, an incredible order, just happen by accident? Because an atheist actually believes nothing created everything, which is scientifically impossible.
You're misrepresenting again, Ray. Unfortunately, we can't have this discussion face to face, though.
You're not just a blob of nothing that came from an explosion that created order, which is against nature.
Well, when you say it like that, it sounds pretty depressing, but I'm not just a blob of nothing. I'm a Homo sapien, the result of billions of years of evolution from a line of resourceful survivors that navigated their way through more than half a dozen extinction events to become the dominant species on the planet. As far as I'm concerned, that's a proud heritage to have. It certainly sounds better than being told I was born broken and defective and that I have to plead forgiveness for something that A, never happened, and B, wasn't my fault. The explosion you keep referring to wasn't apparently against nature, as there is a natural explanation for it. We just don't know yet, and that's okay.
That means that you've got purpose and meaning in the universe. So it's not altogether bad news.
Yeah, I know I've got purpose and meaning. My purpose is determined by me, which right now is to educate people that you mislead with pseudoscience and misrepresentation. In the long run, it's to raise my kids to be critical thinkers who can evaluate information and to teach them the difference between right and wrong. Yes, atheists have morals, and we don't need a God to get them, especially since our moral standards are far superior to anything you will find in holy books. As for meaning, that is determined by the kind of relationships that I have with others and how my life affected them. There seems to be this stigma attached to atheists that we're miserable, violent despots who don't care about anything at all, which is not true. I'd like to have a better paying job and a few things around the house, but all things considered, I'm happy with my life. To say that atheists can't know joy or love or awe is honestly just stupid.
In June of 2016, I interviewed theoretical physicist Professor Lawrence Krauss and asked him the same questions I asked the university students. I was limited to only asking questions, but he was very gracious, and it was an honor to meet him.
Lucky bastard. I'd love to meet him and have a sit down. There's a lot he could clear up for me. One day, maybe I'll get the chance. By the way, you were limited to asking questions because he's a busy guy, and that was an interview, not a debate.
Lawrence, why are you an atheist?
Well, you know, I don't call myself an atheist any more than I call myself an leprechaunist. In fact, I don't label myself as ist. The only ist I might use is a scientist. And that's really important to me because as a scientist, I don't accept things without evidence. And there's certainly no evidence for God. And all the stories about the different gods, as there have been thousands of them, all seem equally ridiculous.
There's millions.
Yeah, probably at least millions.
Are you open to evidence?
I'm absolutely open to evidence. In fact, I change my mind all the time. That's the great thing about being a scientist. Unlike religion, we don't assume we have all the answers. In fact, we ask the questions, and we let nature tell us the answer.
I noticed you picked up this book before. Do you believe this book could make itself? Let me give you this scenario. That ink fell on the pages, colored photos just manifest when ink fell out of nowhere. The sentences became coherent with periods and commas.
No, which is one of the reasons why the way that the Bible was written by humans, because it didn't make itself. There were some bunch of largely literate Iron Age peasants who were trying to understand the world and didn't know much about science, and they wrote in different forms books. And
okay, so the fourth question:
could a book arise spontaneously from nothing? Absolutely. But could it make itself? No. There's two very different things, because you're implying design, intent, etc., which is what, of course, you do.
DNA is called the Book of Life. Could DNA make itself?
Well, see, that's where the question is ridiculous, because, in fact, DNA doesn't make itself any more than a snowflake makes itself. A snowflake is a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it's assembled by nature. It doesn't make itself. It's the laws of physics and chemistry, polar molecules, that make this incredibly complex, beautiful structure. Now, the same thing with DNA. DNA is an amazing structure, and the laws of physics, chemistry, and ultimately biology, but which derives from that, will in principle explain how DNA first arose. You give me the laws of polar molecules and I'll give you a snowflake. There's no intent, no grand purpose, no design behind it. Even though they look designed, the illusion of design is an illusion.
It pains me to know that you didn't walk away from your interview with Professor Krauss having learned nothing. One of the brightest minds of our day, and you wasted his time. He was indeed generous with you.
Natural law does indeed produce complex structures like snowflakes. But the law that produces that kind of complexity is simply the same chemical reaction repeating over and over. That is not information. What's stored in the DNA molecule is specified information, like the information found in a book or a computer program.
You're oversimplifying this again. DNA causes many chemical reactions that, in effect, cascade, producing living organisms. It's not magic, it's organic chemistry.
The fact that a book requires an author and a program requires a programmer is not an illusion. It is factual as seen in the real world around us. It isn't apparent design, it is real design, as any college student can tell you.
You really need to get past this presupposition of a designer, at least until you show being capable of such a thing exists.
Do you believe the instruction book for life happened by chance? No.
Just as an aside, did anyone else notice the suspicious cut Ray put in there? Part of what is irritating to me about this video is that at no point do we see Ray in front of the camera so we can verify what he's saying to these students before they respond. He may be on the up and up with most of it, but this is the first time he edits the video like this, so it makes me suspicious. Anyway, what were you saying, Ray?
So it couldn't happen by chance, could it? No.
Again, I'm not getting a warm and fuzzy here. That's the kind of no you get from someone that is telling you that they don't want to talk to you or that you have said something that they completely disagree with.
So where did the intelligent information to selectively arrange the building blocks of DNA come from? That know-how and forethought does not exist in any of the materials from which life is made, and the laws of nature have no purposeful capacity to write a book or arrange its pages. So where did that specified information come from? Its origin is certainly supernatural.
You're talking about emergent complexity again. Remember earlier when I said that the appearance of design isn't indicative of design? But please, do tell me how you reached this conclusion, Ray. I'd love to hear this.
What Professor Krauss completely overlooks is the external nature of the information encoded into the DNA molecule. A complete set of software instructions directing the formation and reproduction of human beings, both male and female, and all other living things.
External nature? How did he fail to account for the fact that DNA determines our sex? You realize that gamete cells date back to when multicellular life was just kicking off, right? Some dude didn't wander around looking for a female to reproduce with. They were both in the population. That's literally the way it's been since gamete cells developed.
Bill Gates once said, DNA is like a computer software program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created.
I have noticed that you insisted on only interviewing or referencing people that are not biologists. You seem to be going to a lot of trouble to avoid talking to subject matter experts.
Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, that came out of nowhere. The answer is chicken, as in life came before the egg. Before the egg developed, genetic information was passed between organisms through contact by horizontal gene transfer. You looked around a bit before someone gave you the answer you were looking for, at which point this happened.
The egg. Egg, okay. Was the egg fertilized?
The egg would have been fertilized to produce viable offspring, so my answer still stands.
So if the chicken came first, it then laid an egg. Okay? Was the egg fertilized?
Yes. Again, you seem to think that a male and female developed on opposite sides of the planet. They would both be in the population, and the number of each would be determined by selective pressures that would facilitate the survival of the species.
Okay, so where did you come from?
My parents. specifically a recombination of their genetic material from the gamete cells.
Where did they come from?
Their parents.
And where did they come from?
Again, their parents. All by the same way I came about. What's your point?
Right back to Adam.
That's a hell of a jump to make, but no. Complex multicellular life like human beings don't survive with such a limited gene pool. The lack of genetic diversity would result in extinction. I don't care how perfect your DNA is or how long you live. With an average of about 120 mutations per zygote, which is a fertilized egg at this point, any detrimental mutations in the coding or regulatory sections of the DNA would compound over a short period of time and result in extinction. There is a minimum population density that you have to have in order for a population to not interbreed itself into extinction. That's why cheetahs are really honestly endangered species, because they hit a genetic bottleneck at some point in their ancestry, and it reduced the population down so low that the cheetah is effectively inbred now. If they'd gone much lower in population than they did, they'd be extinct now. That's why severe inbreeding causes defects and is unsustainable. Genetics don't allow that. Single cell and microscopic multicellular life can get away with it because of the simpler form and lifestyle they have, but on the macro scale, at our level, it will not work.
Adam was created by God, and he made male and female, and he made the birds of the air and made them male and female so they could reproduce after their own kind. Okay, explain this to me. If you really believe in evolution, before it had eyes, how did it see?
That depends entirely on what you mean by both eyes and see. The earliest eyes were nothing more than photosensitive cells, not too dissimilar from the perennial eyes on lizards. They could only detect light and dark. Sight is a wonderful advantage to have, so there was a strong pressure to develop more of these cells and for them to develop greater sensitivity. The pressure to develop sight is so strong that it evolved quickly and independently in many different lines of descent, with different specializations from the camera eye to the compound eye, each being beneficial to the organism that has it.
Well, did it have a brain, or couldn't have a brain until the brain evolved? So how did it think to look for food, and where did the food come from?
This, again, depends entirely what you mean by brain. The earliest organisms would have had what amounts to a purely reflexive nervous system without any real thinking involved. They reacted to their environment without any plan or strategy. The food would have been other organisms in the area. It's not like substantial divergence hadn't happened by that point. And even before that, simpler organisms would have fed on something like geothermal vents, like deep-sea organisms do today. No big mystery here.
And why did the food evolve? And did it have lungs? Do you think the chicken thing, before it evolved into chicken, had lungs?
You're acting like food evolved solely to be consumed by other organisms, which is idiotic. The food for organisms evolved independently, and it developed defenses in response to predation. A biological arms race, with neither side knowing or realizing it was happening. As for lungs, yes, lungs developed long before the first things crawled out of the water onto land, as a hybrid between a buoyancy bladder and an actual lung. That way it could get more oxygen than the gills could regularly provide. This gave those animals much greater endurance, and as a result was a very desirable selective pressure.
If it breathed air, was the air 20% oxygen as it is now, and why did the air evolve? And why did it evolve lungs, and how did it survive before it had lungs?
You know, I've always been of the opinion that there's no such thing as a stupid question. Ray, you're making me seriously reconsider that position. From what I understand, yes, at the time the atmosphere was very similar in O2 content as it is today. Oxygen didn't evolve. You're misusing terms again. Oxygen was produced as a waste product by cyanobacteria in early plant life, the same as with plants and algae today. Every other question you have asked, I already answered earlier.
It doesn't really make sense when you think about it, because you've got to translate that to elephants, horses, cats, cows, human beings, every living thing apparently evolved from stars.
This was in reference to an earlier clip that I cut out where Neil deGrasse Tyson repeats what Carl Sagan said about all of us being made of stardust. Simple forms of life do not require a brain, eyes, lungs, etc. to survive, at least not in the way we do. That's how this all started. Simple life giving way to more complex forms as a result of competition and natural selective pressures.
Which came first in the chicken? Was it its blood, or its heart, or its blood vessels? Which evolved first?
That would be the blood vessels that developed first, right? They developed as a way to more efficiently transport nutrients around the body and remove waste more efficiently. Blood itself came next, and the heart started as nothing more than an enlarged artery that could be squeezed internally to move more blood throughout the body.
Can you think of anyone that isn't fully evolved?
This is a perfect setup for me to say something snide, but I'll refrain from it. I've had about as much of Ray as I can for now, so we'll pick this up next time. As always, I can be found on Twitter. Facebook had an issue with me using something other than my real name, so I'm not there for the time being until I fix that. The Discord server is still up, and patrons get access to my content 2 days before everyone else. If you like what I do, consider becoming a patron. Every little bit helps, and helps me put out more content more often and better quality. And as always, stay curious, guys.